Imagine a world where the most powerful military alliance in human history didn't end with a bang, but with a trap. Look at Brussels. These are the halls of NATO headquarters, now empty, silent, save for the hum of failing generators and the ghostly flicker of lights that no one is left to fix. For decades, we called it the Shield of the West. But in this timeline, the shield became a shackle. We are told that Article 5 is our greatest insurance policy, the sacred vow that an attack on one is an attack on all. It was meant to be the ultimate deterrent. But what happens when that deterrent is transformed into a suicide pact? What if a minor provocation, triggered by a desperate ally in a corner of the world most Americans couldn't find on a map, forces the United States into a war it cannot win and a conflict it cannot survive? This is the story of the Great Atlantic Trap, a reality where the very mechanism designed to prevent a global catastrophe becomes the primary engine of its arrival. In this world, the ink on the North Atlantic Treaty didn't just sign a pact of protection, it signed a death warrant for the American century. The tripwire has been pulled, the gears are grinding, and the safety net is about to become a noose. To understand how the trap snapped shut, we have to look at how the mechanism was forged. In 1949, the world was still a landscape of ash and mourning. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization was birthed not just as a military alliance, but as a psychological wall. Its architects designed a tripwire strategy, a thin line of American boots stationed on foreign soil, serving as a silent promise that any aggression would be met with the full, unbridled fury of the United States. At the center of this architecture lies Article 5. It is perhaps the most consequential sentence in the history of international law. An armed attack against one or more of them shall be considered an attack against them all. For over 70 years, this was the ultimate deterrent. It told the world that a skirmish on a remote border was, in fact, a declaration of war against the largest nuclear arsenal on the planet. It transformed the collective strength of the West into a single, unbreakable fist. But embedded within this sacred promise is a phenomenon known as strategic moral hazard. It is a cold, calculated risk that haunts every insurance policy. When a smaller nation is shielded by a superpower's umbrella, the incentive for caution begins to evaporate. If you know that your survival is guaranteed by a distant giant, you might find yourself walking closer to the edge. You might take risks that a nation standing alone would never dare. You might assume that the giant will always be there to catch you no matter who threw the first punch. In our world, diplomacy and shared interests have largely kept this hazard in check. The alliance was built on the assumption that every member would act with the same level of restraint. But in the timeline we are about to enter, that restraint is the first thing to die. The tripwire is no longer a warning to the enemy, it has become a lure for the desperate. The safety net is about to be pulled taut, and for the first time, it won't be the aggressor who gets caught. It will be the protector. The year is 2020X, and the theoretical becomes terrifyingly real in the Suwalki Gap, a 60-mile strip of land that separates the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad from its ally, Belarus. In our world, it is a point of tension. In this timeline, it is the spark that ignites the world. It begins not with a declaration of war, but with a shadow, a gray zone provocation, a non-state militia wearing no flags and carrying no IDs, seizes a vital rail junction, plunging the local power grid into darkness. Communication lines are severed and GPS signals across the region begin to flicker and die. To a frontline NATO member, this isn't just a border skirmish, it's the perceived opening salvo of a total invasion. Haunted by the ghost of the 20th century and convinced that the bureaucracy in Brussels will be too slow to react, the ally chooses a path of active defense. Without consulting Washington, they launch a barrage of precision missiles across the border, vaporizing a Russian logistics hub they believe is the staging ground for an imminent assault. As the smoke rises over the burning wreckage, the trap snaps shut. The ally immediately broadcasts to the world, "We have been attacked. We are defending our sovereignty." They officially invoke Article 5. They don't ask for help, they demand it. By the letter of the law, an armed attack has occurred, and the mechanism of collective defense is triggered. The United States is no longer a spectator or a mediator. It is a combatant, bound by a 70-year-old promise to a war it never wanted, sparked by a fire it didn't light. The tripwire hasn't just been tripped. It's been pulled by the very hands it was meant to protect. Inside the White House, the air is heavy with a silence that feels like the end of an era. The President of the United States stares at a digital map where a single blinking red dot in Eastern Europe threatens to consume the world. This is the American dilemma. To ignore the invocation of Article 5 would be an act of geopolitical suicide. It would signal to every ally and every adversary that the American security guarantee is a hollow promise, effectively dismantling the global order overnight. If Washington stays silent now, every treaty from Tokyo to Seoul becomes scrap paper. But to honor it means marching headlong into a high-intensity, nuclear-capable conflict over a border skirmish that Washington did not start and cannot control. It is the ultimate checkmate. The pressure from across the Atlantic is relentless. Secure lines from Warsaw to Brussels are flooded with demands for immediate U.S. mobilization. European leaders, gripped by an existential terror, aren't looking for a diplomatic exit. They are demanding the full weight of the American military machine. They cite 70 years of rhetoric, thousands of joint exercises, and the sacred nature of the alliance. To them, American hesitation isn't seen as strategic caution. It is seen as a betrayal of the highest order. But back home, the American consensus is shattering. The United States begins to fracture under the weight of the commitment. In the halls of Congress and on the streets of the heartland, the globalists argue that the cost of inaction is a world ruled by chaos and the eventual death of democracy. Opposing them is a surging, visceral isolationist movement that takes to the streets of every major city. Their message is blunt and increasingly popular. Why should Chicago burn for a village we can't find on a map? The air in D.C. is thick with the realization that the trap hasn't just caught the military. It has caught the American soul. The decision isn't between war and peace. It's between a slow, agonizing decline of credibility or a sudden, explosive catastrophe. As the first transport planes begin to warm their engines on runways across the Midwest, the realization sinks in. The United States is no longer the master of its own destiny. The shield has finally become a shackle, dragging a reluctant superpower toward a precipice it spent decades trying to avoid. The U.S. isn't leading this charge. It's being pulled into the dark. As the first American boots touch European soil, a second front opens, one that cannot be won with cruise missiles or stealth fighters. In a desperate bid to paralyze the adversary without a full-scale nuclear exchange, Washington triggers maximum pressure sanctions, a total economic embargo designed to starve the enemy's war machine. But in the interconnected web of global trade, this lever is a double-edged sword. The blow meant to shatter the Kremlin instead severs the final arteries of energy flowing into the heart of Europe. Overnight, the Eurozone's energy supply evaporates. The industrial engines of Germany, the backbone of the European economy, grind to a screeching halt. In Paris, Berlin, and Rome, the grand promises of the alliance are drowned out by the roar of the mob. This isn't the unified front the planners in Brussels envisioned. This is chaos. High-speed rails sit idle, factories are shuttered, and as winter sets in, the shield of the West begins to freeze. Massive protests erupt, not against the invader, but against the crushing cost of a war the average citizen never asked for. Then comes the twist that truly snaps the trap shut. Washington realizes that a bankrupt, rioting Europe is a strategic liability it cannot afford. To prevent a total continental collapse, the United States is forced into an impossible role, the sole financier of a dying union. It is no longer enough to send tanks and ammunition. The U.S. must now subsidize the heating bills of millions and prop up the cratering euro with trillions in emergency credit. What began as a military obligation has transformed into an economic black hole. Every dollar spent to keep the lights on in Europe is a dollar stolen from the American taxpayer, fueling the fires of resentment back home. The trap has expanded. The U.S. isn't just defending Europe's borders. It is now chained to its very survival, pouring its future into a void that shows no sign of filling. As the frost thickens on the windows of the Élysée Palace and the Bundestag, a chilling realization sets in. The American cure is deadlier than the Russian disease. For Paris and Berlin, the unwavering support of Washington has become a suicide pact. Their industries are gutted, their currencies are in free fall, and their streets are on fire. The shield hasn't just become a shackle, it's become a noose. In the dimly lit corridors of power, a shadow diplomacy takes root. France, long a skeptic of American hegemony, quietly opens a back channel to Moscow. The message is simple. Europe cannot survive a forever war for a border it didn't choose to fight over. Behind closed doors, the blueprints for a European security architecture are drawn. A new order that deliberately excludes the United States. It is the ultimate geopolitical divorce, whispered in the dark, while American soldiers still freeze in the trenches of the Suwalki Gap. The betrayal soon spills into the light. At Ramstein Air Base in Germany and Aviano in Italy, American service members wake up not to the cheers of liberated allies, but to the roar of thousands demanding they leave. Yankee Go Home becomes the rallying cry of a continent that feels sacrificed on the altar of American globalism. The very people the U.S. is bankrupting itself to protect now view the Stars and Stripes as a target of rage. Trust, the invisible glue of the alliance for 70 years, has evaporated. Washington finds itself in the most dangerous position a superpower can occupy, fighting a war for allies who are already negotiating its expulsion. The shield is shattered, and as the Atlantic divide widens into a chasm, the rest of the world begins to take notice. While the American eagle is clawing at its own reflection in the Atlantic, a different predator is watching from the east, realizing that the superpower is finally, fatally distracted. While the Atlantic burns, the Pacific falls into a chilling, calculated silence. In Beijing, the Great Hall of the People has become a laboratory of opportunity. For decades, the American military machine was built on the doctrine of being able to fight two major regional wars simultaneously, but that doctrine assumed a stable domestic economy and a functional industrial base. Now, with American munitions depots drained to supply a crumbling European front and its treasury hemorrhaging billions to prop up the euro, that capacity has evaporated. The dragon watches as the eagle's gaze is fixed firmly on the Suwalki Gap. Satellite imagery shows American carrier strike groups, once the undisputed masters of the Philippine Sea, being redirected to the North Atlantic to escort shivering fuel tankers and guard against the Russian submarine threat. The Pacific pivot that Washington promised for over a decade is not just dead. It has been inverted. Seeing the opening, Beijing moves with surgical precision. This is the moment of the opportunist. No longer content with mere rhetoric, Chinese maritime militias and naval task forces begin a rapid, unopposed consolidation of the South China Sea. Island by island, reef by reef, the 9-dash line is transformed from a mapmaker's dream into a concrete reality of missile batteries and deep water ports. The message to America's Asian allies, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, is deafeningly clear. The arsenal of democracy is out of stock. The realization hits the Pentagon like a physical blow. The NATO trap has achieved what decades of conventional buildup never could. It has neutralized American power in the Indo-Pacific without China firing a single shot at a U.S. sailor. Washington is paralyzed. To pivot back to Asia would mean the total collapse of the European front and the abandonment of its remaining allies to a Russian advance. To stay in Europe is to hand the keys of the 21st century to Beijing. The shield hasn't just failed to protect Brussels. It has successfully blinded the United States to the loss of its global hegemony. The regional skirmish in the Suwalki Gap has officially metastasized into a global catastrophe. As the American shadow recedes from the Pacific, the world realizes that the American century isn't ending with a bang, but with a desperate, distracted whimper. The geopolitical map is being redrawn in real time, and the ink is being provided by the very alliance that was supposed to keep the world stable. But as the external world fractures, the internal structure of NATO itself is about to experience a terminal breach. The global chessboard has shifted, but the fracture at the heart of the alliance is now terminal. NATO is no longer a monolith. it has split into two irreconcilable camps, creating a two-tier reality that the founding fathers of the North Atlantic Treaty never envisioned. In the east, from Warsaw to Tallinn, the air is thick with the smell of diesel and dread. To this eastern flank, Article 5 is not a legal abstraction. It is a survival manual. These nations demand every American soldier, every Abrams tank, and every Patriot battery be pushed to the front lines immediately. For them, there is no room for nuance, no space for diplomacy. It is total defense or total annihilation. But 1,000 miles to the west, in the glass towers of Brussels and the parliaments of Paris and Rome, the sentiment is chillingly different. The western flank watches as their industries go dark and their citizens face a winter of freezing temperatures and hyperinflation. To them, the Suwalki Gap is a distant flashpoint that isn't worth the incineration of Western Europe. They are no longer looking for a win. They are desperate for an off-ramp. They want a deal with Moscow, and they want it before the first tactical nuclear shadow falls over the Rhine. This internal schism has paralyzed the most sophisticated military machine in human history. In the command centers of Mons, Belgium, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, an American general, finds himself presiding over a ghost ship. The integrated command is seizing up. One phone call from London demands an aggressive naval blockade. The next, from Berlin, threatens to deny U.S. transport planes access to German airspace if the escalation continues. Intelligence is being withheld between allies who no longer trust each other's endgames. Orders are issued, then immediately countermanded by national governments terrified of being the next target. Visualize the map of the Blue Alliance. For 70 years, it was a solid, reassuring block of stability. Now, that blue is dissolving, bleeding into a chaotic mosaic of gray and red. Nations that once spoke with a single thunderous voice are now whispering in the dark, cutting side deals and closing their borders to their own allies. The organizational death of NATO is no longer a what-if. It is happening in real time. The shield has shattered, leaving the pieces to fall where they may. And as the alliance withers, the consequences of the trap are finally jumping the Atlantic, heading straight for the American heartland. The Atlantic Ocean, once a 3,000-mile moat of safety, has become a conveyor belt of crisis. For decades, the American public viewed NATO as a distant insurance policy, a line item in a budget they never read. But as the Suwalki Gap burns, the trap finally hits the American heartland with the force of a hurricane. In the supermarkets of Ohio and the gas stations of California, the cost of the alliance is no longer abstract. Hyperinflation, fueled by the total disruption of global trade and the astronomical cost of a two-front mobilization, tears through the middle class. The dollar, once the undisputed king of the world, begins to buckle under the weight of a war that has no end in sight. But it isn't just currency being spent, it's lives. The return of the draft is the spark that turns a simmering country into a powder keg. For the first time since Vietnam, the Selective Service System hums to life, sending letters to doorsteps from Seattle to Savannah. The reaction is immediate and violent. The streets of Washington, D.C. are choked with smoke as the largest protest in American history erupt. It is the 1960s on steroids, fueled by the digital speed of the 21st century and a deep, visceral sense of betrayal. The question on every protester's lips is the same. Why are we burning our future for a border dispute in a land we cannot find on a map? Out of this chaos, a new political titan rises, the Fortress America movement. This isn't just traditional isolationism, it is a desperate, survivalist ideology that spreads like wildfire through both political parties. Its message is simple and seductive. Bring them home. Close the borders. Let Europe solve European problems. The movement advocates for a total withdrawal from all overseas commitments, arguing that the global policeman has finally run out of blood and treasure. Inside the Oval Office, the air is thick with the scent of a dying era. The U.S. government is trapped in the ultimate geopolitical vice. On one side, the sacred Article 5 treaty, the promise that defined the free world for 70 years. On the other, the literal survival of the United States as a functional, unified nation. To honor the treaty is to invite civil war and economic collapse at home. To break it is to destroy American credibility forever and hand the world to its rivals. The tension reaches a breaking point. The government is paralyzed, the military is overextended, and the social fabric is tearing at the seams. The trap has done more than just pin down the U.S. military. It has broken the American spirit. Washington is forced to make a choice that was once unthinkable. The American century is ending not with the bang of a nuclear silo, but with the scratching of a pen on a document that will change the world forever. In a move that sends shockwaves through every capital from Tokyo to London, the President of the United States addresses a fractured nation. The words are carefully chosen, cloaked in the language of national preservation, but the meaning is unmistakable. Washington unilaterally announces a temporary suspension of all NATO treaty obligations. The rationale is simple. The American house is on fire, and it can no longer afford to fight the flames in someone else's yard. In an instant, the foundational pillar of global security for 3/4 of a century, the guarantee that an attack on one is an attack on all, simply evaporates. The silence that follows is deafening, but it doesn't last long. As the first American transport planes begin the long journey home, the geopolitical vacuum begins to roar. Across the globe, regional hegemons who have been waiting for decades for this very moment realize the global policeman has finally clocked out. Maps that have remained static since the end of the Cold War are redrawn in a matter of hours. For the nations of Eastern Europe, the nightmare becomes reality. In Warsaw, Tallinn, and Vilnius, the lights in the government buildings burn through the night as leaders realize they are now truly, terrifyingly alone. The tripwire has been cut. Facing a massive mobilized military force across their borders with no superpower backing, the sense of abandonment is total. The shield hasn't just been lowered, it's been taken home to be beaten into a fence. This is the moment the trap finally snaps shut. By seeking to escape the entanglement of a minor border skirmish, the United States has inadvertently triggered a global free-for-all. The Great Withdrawal doesn't bring the peace the Fortress America movement promised. Instead, it leaves a world in chaos, an alliance in ruins, and a continent on the brink of a darkness it hasn't seen in a century. The American century is over, and the vacuum left behind is being filled by forces that have no interest in democracy, stability, or the rules of the old world. The vacuum left by the American retreat is not filled by the peace of our time promised by isolationist politicians. It is filled by a cold, calculated new order. In the gilded halls of the Kremlin and the Great Hall of the People, a new map of the world is inked into existence. They call it the Eurasian Security Pact, a cynical, ironclad alliance between Moscow and Beijing that rapidly expands to include former American partners who can no longer afford the luxury of principles. In this new era, the language of democracy and human rights is scrubbed from the diplomatic lexicon, replaced by a single haunting word: stability. This is a world where borders are determined by the reach of a pipeline and the range of a hypersonic missile. From Istanbul to Berlin, leaders who once looked to Washington for guidance now fly to Beijing to offer tribute, trading their political autonomy for a seat at a table where the rules are written in shadow. The Eurasian Security Pact doesn't care about the consent of the governed, it only cares about the continuity of the regime. Across the oceans, the United States has transformed into what historians call the giant island. It remains a fortress, bristling with enough nuclear fire to end the world 10 times over. But it is a fortress with no gate. With the U.S. dollar no longer the bedrock of global trade and the American Navy confined to its own coastal waters, the American century is viewed in the textbooks of the East as a brief, chaotic anomaly. The superpower has become a hermit kingdom, economically diminished, diplomatically invisible, and strategically irrelevant. The trap didn't just break NATO, it erased the very idea of the West, leaving a heavily armed but hollowed out America to watch from its shores as a new darker sun rises over Eurasia. The world hasn't just changed, it has been fundamentally re-engineered, and for the first time in a century, Washington doesn't even have a seat at the table. But beyond the boardrooms and the bunkers, the cost of the trap is measured in the cold reality of everyday life. In London, once the financial heartbeat of the world, the flickering streetlights give way to scheduled blackouts. Ration cards, a relic of a forgotten century, are once again a daily necessity as the shattered Eurozone struggles to heat its homes without a unified energy policy or American maritime protection. In Warsaw and Tallinn, the vibrant neon-lit boulevards have gone silent. These cities, once the proud front line of Western democracy, are now buffer zones, darkened, demilitarized shells where the only sound is the rhythmic drone of Eurasian patrols overhead. Across the Atlantic, the American dream has been replaced by a fortress mentality. The coastline is no longer a gateway to the world, but a perimeter to be defended. A great wall of sensors, drones, and steel now lines the borders, signaling a total paranoid withdrawal from a world that has moved on. The American century didn't end with a bang or a mushroom cloud. It ended with the slow, agonizing snap of a legal trap. A treaty meant to ensure eternal security became the anchor that dragged the superpower into the abyss. By the time Washington realized the true cost of its commitment, the world it had built was already gone, leaving behind a legacy of what-ifs and a global map, redrawn in the colors of a new, unforgiving empire. The shield that became a shackle had finally finished its work, leaving the West to wither in the shadow of its own broken promises. But this is not our world. In the reality we inhabit, the shield has not become a shackle. Instead, the North Atlantic Treaty remains one of the most sophisticated diplomatic tightropes ever walked. While the nightmare of a legal trap is a compelling thought experiment, the actual architecture of NATO is designed specifically to prevent the kind of strategic moral hazard that leads to global collapse. In our world, Article 5 is not a blind, mechanical trigger. It is a political process. Before a single shot is fired in the name of the collective, Article 4 mandates immediate and exhaustive consultation. This allows the major powers, most notably the United States, to scrutinize any provocation or gray zone incident before committing their blood and treasure. This is the essence of strategic ambiguity. It ensures that while an aggressor must fear the collective might of the West, a single member cannot simply drag 31 other nations into a war of choice through a reckless, preemptive strike. Furthermore, the reality of NATO's integrated military command structure serves as a massive institutional break. No single member state can easily hijack the alliance's combined assets for a private border dispute. Orders flow through a multinational chain of command where de-escalation protocols are hardwired into every exercise and deployment. Even during the most strained periods of modern history, such as the friction surrounding the NATO-Russia Founding Act, the mechanism has functioned to prevent rogue escalations from spiraling out of control. In the real world, the tripwire is not a trap for the United States. It is a calculated warning to the world that the cost of aggression is too high to pay. We do not live in the shadow of darkened European cities or of fortress America cut off from the globe. We live in a system that has, for over 7 decades, mastered the art of the pause, the crucial diplomatic moment between a border skirmish and a global catastrophe. The nightmare we've just witnessed remains exactly that, a fiction designed to remind us why the guardrails of history were built in the first place. The reason this nightmare remains a fiction is because the architects of our world understood a fundamental truth. A military alliance without a political soul is a suicide pact. In the dark timeline we explored, the gears of war turned automatically, fueled by fear and rigid legalities. In our reality, those gears are jammed by design. We must recognize that NATO is, first and foremost, a political forum. It is a room where 32 different nations, each with their own domestic pressures and historical traumas, must find consensus before a single missile is fueled. This inherent friction, the very thing critics often call bureaucratic or slow, is actually the world's most vital safety valve. It prevents the strategic moral hazard by ensuring that no minor border incident can bypass the collective scrutiny of the most powerful nations on Earth. Furthermore, the alliance has proven remarkably resilient in the face of modern, unconventional threats. In the dark timeline, a gray zone provocation led to a total collapse of the global order. In our world, NATO has developed a nuanced toolkit for hybrid warfare that avoids the binary choice between surrender and nuclear escalation. When cyber attacks hit or disinformation campaigns flare up, the response isn't a world-ending surge of tanks. It's a coordinated intelligence effort, targeted economic pressure, and reinforced digital defenses. We have learned to navigate the shadows without burning down the house. By looking into the abyss of what could have been, the shattered economies, the betrayed allies, and a lonely, isolated America, we see the true value of the messy, complicated, and often frustrating diplomacy that keeps our world intact. The horror of the failure we've just visualized isn't a prediction. It's a testament to the strength of the guardrails that continue to hold. These protocols weren't written in a vacuum. They were forged from the lessons of 2 world wars to ensure that no single mistake could ever again end the human story. The trap hasn't snapped because we built the alliance to be a shield, not just for territory, but for time. The time needed for reason to prevail over reflex. Ultimately, what this thought experiment reveals is that peace is not merely the absence of war, it is the presence of an incredibly complex, often invisible architecture. It is easy to criticize the slow-moving gears of international diplomacy, to scoff at the red tape of treaties, or to fear the obligations we hold to distant lands. But as we've seen, the alternative, a world where those gears seize or where those obligations snap, is a descent into a darkness from which there may be no return. The trap we've explored today is a chilling reminder of how easily a single spark in a remote corner of the globe could ignite a chain reaction that consumes every home, every market, and every future. Yet, we should find a profound sense of relief in the fact that despite the headlines and the very real tensions of our era, this nightmare remains confined to the realm of what if. Our world is not governed by the cold, unthinking logic of a machine, but by the cautious hands of people who understand the stakes. In an age of rapid information and rising friction, it is more important than ever to engage with history, not as a collection of dry dates, but as a living manual for survival. To value geopolitical stability is to value the very foundation of our daily lives. It is the silent, useless work of thousands of diplomats, officers, and leaders who choose the frustration of conversation over the finality of confrontation every single day. As the camera pulls back, we see the NATO flag and the American flag flying side by side, steady against the wind. They represent more than just symbols of power. They are a commitment to a shared destiny that, however flawed, has prevented the catastrophic collapse of the West for nearly a century. We live in a world where the guardrails held. Let us be grateful for the stability we often take for granted and mindful of the immense effort required to maintain it. Because, in the end, the greatest victory of any alliance is not the battle won, but the war that never had to be fought. Thank you for watching.